I understand you have no partner for tonight's ball.
You are the reason I have no partner.
Then perhaps I owe you a dance. I suggest you wear the pearls.
Lady Genevieve Ashford had sewn 1,400 seed pearls onto her ball gown by hand. Every single one of them was going to waste. She sat at the writing desk in her private study, the gown hanging from a dressmaker's form near the window, like a ghost waiting for someone to step inside it. Ivory silk, hand-stitched lace trim along the bodice, a skirt that caught lamplight the way still water catches moonlight. She had spent 4 months preparing it for tonight, 4 months of fittings and fabric selections, and quiet, careful hope that this year would be different. It was not different. The estate ball, the most prestigious social gathering in 3 counties, was 6 hours away. Every landed family, every merchant of standing, every eligible gentleman and titled lord would be there. And Lady Genevieve Ashford, mistress of Ashford Hall and sole head of one of the oldest estates in the Southern District, had no partner. She picked up the letter on her desk and read it again, though she had already memorized every line. Lord Pemberton's handwriting was careful and polite, the way a man writes when he is trying to sound sorry without actually being sorry. Dear Lady Ashford, I regret that circumstances prevent me from honoring our arrangement. I trust you will understand that my position requires me to consider all associations with great care. I wish you a pleasant evening. Circumstances, associations, pleasant evening. She folded the letter and set it down. Lord Pemberton was the 9th man to withdraw his offer to escort her this season. The 9th. Some had been blunt about their reasons. Most had hidden behind vague excuses. But the truth was always the same. Nobody wanted to stand beside a woman who was at war with the Duke of Ravenscroft. The feud between House Ashford and House Ravenscroft was older than Genevieve herself. 3 generations of broken contracts, stolen trade routes, public accusations, and legal battles that had filled courtroom ledgers for decades. Her late father had spent the final years of his life locked in bitter correspondence with the old Duke. When both men died within a year of each other, everyone assumed the quarrel would die with them. Instead, it got worse. The new Duke, Nicholas Ravenscroft, had inherited his title at 23 and immediately tightened his grip on every shipping lane and wool contract his family controlled. Genevieve, who had inherited Ashford Hall at 21 after her mother's passing, found herself boxed out of markets she had counted on for survival. They had never spoken face to face. They had never needed to. Their solicitors did the fighting for them, and the local gentry did the choosing. And they chose Ravenscroft. They always chose Ravenscroft. Which meant Genevieve attended dinners alone, rode to church alone, managed her estate alone. And now, for the 3rd consecutive year, she would either skip the most important ball of the social calendar, or walk in without a partner and give every gossip in the county exactly what they wanted. Proof that Lady Ashford was as isolated as they whispered. She pushed back from the desk and walked to the window. The late afternoon sky was bruised with the threat of rain, and the gardens below were still. Her brothers, Edmund and Charles, had ridden north 2 days ago to settle a grain shipment dispute. The household staff moved quietly through the corridors. The whole manor felt like it was holding its breath. Genevieve pressed her forehead against the cool glass. She could stay home. She could write a note to the Earl's household claiming illness. She could preserve what little dignity remained and spend the evening in her study with a pot of tea and a ledger full of numbers that never seemed to add up properly. She had nearly convinced herself to do exactly that when the front door knocker struck 3 times. The sound carried through the entrance hall and up the staircase with the sharpness of a gunshot. Genevieve straightened. She was not expecting anyone. The post had already come. Her brothers would not return for days, and no one from the local families called on her anymore. That particular courtesy had dried up 2 seasons ago. She heard Mrs. Aldridge, the housekeeper, crossing the entrance hall below. The front door groaned open on its iron hinges. Then silence. A long, strange silence. Genevieve stepped out of her study and moved to the top of the staircase. From there, she could see straight down into the entrance hall, past the oak banister and the portrait of her grandfather, all the way to the open front door. A man stood on the threshold, tall, dark-haired, wearing a long riding coat still damp at the shoulders from the drizzle outside. His boots were muddied from the road, and he held his hat in one hand as if he had removed it the moment the door opened. Mrs. Aldridge had taken a full step backward, which was something Genevieve had never seen the woman do in 15 years of service, because the man standing in the doorway was Duke Nicholas Ravenscroft. Genevieve gripped the banister. Her first thought, sharp and automatic, was that something had gone wrong. A legal summons, a new dispute, some fresh disaster delivered in person because a letter would not carry the weight of it. But Ravenscroft did not look like a man delivering threats. He looked up, directly at her, as if he had known exactly where she would be standing. His expression was calm and unreadable, the kind of face that gave nothing away on purpose. And when he spoke, his voice carried up the staircase with the ease of a man accustomed to filling large rooms. "Lady Ashford, I understand you are without a partner for this evening's ball."
Genevieve felt the blood rise in her cheeks. Of course he knew. The whole county knew. Her humiliation was practically public record. "And I understand," she said, keeping her voice steady, "that you are the reason for it." Something shifted in his expression. A flicker at the corner of his mouth that might have been amusement or might have been acknowledgement. He held her gaze without flinching. "Then perhaps I owe you a dance." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. Mrs. Aldridge looked from the Duke to the staircase and back again, her hand still frozen on the door handle. The rain picked up outside, tapping against the stone steps behind him. Genevieve came down the staircase slowly, one hand on the rail, her mind racing through every possible explanation and finding none that made sense. Nicholas Ravenscroft, the man whose family had spent 3 generations trying to crush hers, was standing in her entrance hall, asking to take her to the ball. She stopped on the final step, which put her almost at his eye level, and studied him the way she would study a contract before signing. "Why?" she asked. Nicholas tucked his hat under his arm. "Because what I have to propose will benefit us both, and it begins tonight." He glanced at the gown visible through the open study door upstairs, then back at her. "I suggest you wear the pearls." The carriage rattled over the wet gravel lane and turned south toward the Earl's country estate. Rain streaked sideways across the windows, and the lanterns mounted on either side of the door swung with each rut in the road, throwing patches of amber light across the interior. Genevieve sat on one side, Nicholas sat on the other. The space between them felt like a loaded pistol. She had changed into the gown. She had pinned her hair. She had fastened her mother's pearl earrings with fingers that refused to stay steady, and through every minute of preparation, she had told herself she was making a terrible mistake. Mrs. Aldridge had said as much with her eyes alone, standing in the doorway of the dressing room with her arms folded and her lips pressed into a line so thin they nearly vanished. But Genevieve had come downstairs anyway, because the alternative was another evening alone in a house that felt emptier with each passing season. And because Nicholas Ravenscroft had said the word propose, and she needed to know what he meant by it. "You have until we reach the Earl's gates," she said, adjusting her gloves. "Explain yourself." Nicholas leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. In the shifting lantern light, he looked less like the cold, calculating figure she had built in her mind over the years, and more like a man who had been awake for too long, thinking about something he could not solve alone. "How many trade contracts has your estate lost this year?" he asked. Genevieve's jaw tightened. "That is not your concern." "7, he said. "You have lost 7. I know because 4 of them came to me, and I turned 3 of them away." She stared at him.
You turned them away? They were poor terms. The merchants offered them to me at rates so low they were practically charitable, and charity from a merchant means he expects to collect later in ways you will not enjoy. They came to me because they had nowhere else to go, and they had nowhere else to go because our feud has made the entire district nervous about entering long-term agreements with either house. The carriage jolted over a stone, and Genevieve braced herself against the seat. She wanted to argue with him, but the numbers in her own ledgers confirmed every word. The district's wool trade had slowed to a crawl over the past 2 years. Shipping fees through the southern port had risen because neither estate could negotiate bulk passage without the other undercutting the deal. Their rivalry was bleeding them both dry, and the merchants, the ones who ferried goods between their territories, had simply started taking their business elsewhere. I have spent the last 3 months trying to secure a contract with the Hargrove Trading Company, Nicholas continued. They handle grain, wool, and timber distribution across 4 counties. One agreement with Hargrove would stabilize my estate's income for the next 5 years. And, Genevieve said, and Hargrove refused. Do you know why? She waited. Because their principal investor told them that any firm doing business with Ravenscroft would be shut out of Ashford territory, and any firm doing business with Ashford would be shut out of Ravenscroft territory. The risk was too high, so Hargrove walked away from both of us and signed with the Caldwell family in the next county. Genevieve felt that like a blow. The Caldwell estate was half the size of hers and produced a third of the wool. If Hargrove preferred them over 2 of the district's oldest houses, the situation was far worse than she had calculated. So you came to my door, she said slowly, because you need me. I came to your door because we need each other. He sat back and studied her across the dim carriage. Every major landowner and merchant in the region will be at the ball tonight. If they see us arrive together, the 2 families that have been at each other's throats for 3 generations, walking into the same room, standing side by side, dancing as partners, the message is immediate. The feud is over. Trade flows again. Contracts open up. Hargrove alone would come running back within a fortnight. Genevieve turned the idea over in her mind the way she turned figures in a ledger, searching for the flaw. The logic was sharp. She hated how sharp it was. One evening, she said, you are asking me to pretend that decades of damage between our families can be mended by one waltz. I am asking you to let them believe it can. What happens after tonight, we negotiate on proper terms. He paused. But it starts with the entrance. It starts with the room seeing us together and understanding that the ground has shifted. The carriage wheels hissed against the wet road. Through the rain-streaked glass, Genevieve could see the distant glow of the Earl's estate, hundreds of candles burning behind tall windows, the long drive already lined with carriages and torchlight. They were close. If I do this, she said, meeting his eyes, I need your word on 3 things. First, this is a professional arrangement. You do not speak for my estate and I do not speak for yours. Second, anything we negotiate after tonight goes through formal channels with solicitors present. And third, she held up a gloved finger. If at any point during the evening I feel you are using this truce to embarrass me or gain advantage at my expense, I will walk out, and I will make certain every person in that ballroom knows why. The corner of his mouth lifted by a fraction. Fair terms. I have not finished. You will address me as Lady Ashford in public. You will not take liberties with familiarity. And you will keep your hand at the proper position during every dance. Are we clear? Nicholas held her gaze, and for the first time, something close to genuine respect crossed his face. Perfectly clear, Lady Ashford. The carriage slowed. Gravel crunched beneath the wheels. Outside, footmen in powdered wigs held lanterns against the rain, and the sound of a string orchestra drifted through the grand entrance ahead. Genevieve drew a breath, straightened her spine, and placed her fingers on the handle.
Then let us give them something to talk about. The footman opened the carriage door, and the night rushed in. Cold rain, warm candlelight, the distant swell of violins. Nicholas stepped out first and extended his hand. Genevieve took it, and the leather of his glove was warm against her silk one as she descended the step onto the gravel drive. The Earl of Whitmore's country estate was the largest private residence in the district. Its facade stretched wide beneath a slate roof, every window blazing with the light of what must have been 1,000 candles. Carriages lined the curved drive in a procession of polished wood and brass lanterns, their horses stamping and breathing clouds into the evening air. Footmen in matching livery moved between the vehicles like well-rehearsed actors, guiding guests toward the columned entrance where the doors stood open wide. Genevieve released Nicholas's hand the moment her feet were steady on the ground, but she did not step away from him. This was the arrangement. Proximity was the message. She placed her fingers lightly on his offered arm, and they walked together toward the entrance. The foyer was a crush of silk, perfume, and conversation. Ladies in pale gowns clustered near the staircase. Gentlemen in dark tailcoats lingered by the doorways, glasses of claret already in hand. The air smelled of beeswax candles, French powder, and the faint sweetness of hothouse flowers arranged in towering displays along the walls. A steward at the entrance to the main ballroom raised his staff and struck the floor twice. "Lady Genevieve Ashford of Ashford Hall, His Grace, the Duke of Ravenscroft." Their names landed on the room like a stone dropped into glass. The ballroom was enormous, a high-ceilinged hall with gilded moldings, mirrored panels that doubled the candlelight, and a polished parquet floor that reflected the chandeliers above like a frozen lake. An orchestra occupied a raised platform at the far end, their instruments poised mid-phrase, and between the musicians and the entrance, 300 of the district's most influential people turned their heads at the same moment. Genevieve felt every pair of eyes. She felt the silence spread like frost across a window pane, moving from the couples nearest the door, outward through the crowd, until even the servants carrying trays of champagne slowed their steps. 300 people who had spent years choosing sides in a feud that had shaped the commerce, the politics, and the gossip of the entire region. And here were the two principals of that feud, walking arm in arm through the entrance, as though they had arrived from the same household. Lady Thornton, who stood near the first pillar with a glass of ratafia, set the glass down so quickly it nearly toppled. Sir Edward Barlow, who had refused Genevieve a seat at his supper table last Christmas, took a visible step backward. And the Earl of Whitmore himself, their host, paused his conversation with the bishop mid-sentence and simply stared. Nicholas did not acknowledge any of it. He walked with the unhurried confidence of a man crossing his own drawing room, his posture straight, his expression composed, his arm steady beneath Genevieve's fingers. She matched his pace and kept her chin level. Whatever storm was building behind the whispers, she would not be the one to flinch first. They reached the center of the ballroom floor, just as the orchestra recovered its nerve and struck up a waltz. Nicholas turned to face her. He offered his right hand, palm upward, and inclined his head in a bow that was formal enough for a court presentation. Genevieve placed her hand in his and felt his other hand settle at her waist, at the proper position, exactly as she had demanded in the carriage. They began to dance. He was good. She had not expected that, and it irritated her that she had not expected it. His lead was firm and precise, guiding her through the opening turns with the kind of control that came from years of practice, the sort of dancing masters insisted upon in the great houses. He did not grip too tightly. He did not pull her off balance. Every step landed exactly where it should, and his frame gave her enough room to move without ever letting her drift too far. Genevieve kept her expression pleasant and neutral, the way her mother had taught her to look when she was furious and could not show it. She was furious now,
though the anger had shifted targets. She was angry at the room, at all these people who had abandoned her for 3 years and were now watching her with open fascination, as if her humiliation and her rescue were both forms of entertainment staged for their benefit. The waltz carried them past the first row of spectators, and the whispers resumed in earnest. She caught fragments as they turned. Impossible. They have not spoken in years. Some sort of arrangement, surely. The Ashford estate must be in worse shape than we thought. That last one stung. Genevieve's fingers tightened involuntarily on Nicholas's shoulder, and he glanced down at her. "Steady," he murmured, low enough that only she could hear. "They are doing exactly what we need them to do." She loosened her grip and said nothing. By the time the waltz ended, the atmosphere in the ballroom had shifted. The frozen shock had melted into something warmer and far more useful: curiosity. As Nicholas led her from the dance floor, a circle of guests was already forming around them. Mr. Hargrove, the very merchant Nicholas had mentioned in the carriage, appeared at his elbow within seconds, his round face flushed with wine and eagerness. "Your Grace, Lady Ashford, what a remarkable evening. I wonder if I might call upon you both next week regarding a matter of mutual commercial interest?" Genevieve felt Nicholas's arm shift beneath her hand, a subtle gesture that passed the conversation to her. She turned to Hargrove with a smile she had been saving for 3 lonely years. "We would welcome that conversation, Mr. Hargrove. Shall we say Thursday at Ashford Hall?" Hargrove beamed. 2 more merchants materialized behind him before he had finished nodding. The truce was working. And that, Genevieve thought, as she accepted a glass of champagne from a passing footman, was the most dangerous part of all, because something that worked this well always came with a cost she had not yet seen. The morning after the ball, Genevieve woke to pale grey light and the sound of hooves on gravel. She dressed quickly, choosing a practical dark green traveling dress and her sturdiest boots. The plan had been set the previous evening during a brief, quiet conversation near the ballroom's terrace doors while the rest of the guests danced their 5th set. She and Nicholas would ride together to the mountain town of Oakhaven, where the district's neutral trading post held offices for contract registration. 3 of the merchants from the ball, Hargrove included, had agreed to meet them there by noon to sign preliminary terms. The window was narrow. Enthusiasm faded quickly in business, and if they waited even 2 days, the merchants would start second-guessing themselves, consulting cautious solicitors, and retreating to safer arrangements. Nicholas's carriage arrived at 7:30. He sat inside with a leather folio across his knees, already reviewing the draft terms his clerk had prepared overnight. Genevieve climbed in without ceremony, and they set off northward toward the mountain pass that connected the lowland estates to Oakhaven. The road climbed steadily through rolling farmland before narrowing into the wooded foothills. The rain from the previous night had left the track soft and rutted, and the carriage swayed heavily on its springs as the horses labored uphill. Genevieve reviewed the contract language while bracing herself against the seat, marking adjustments with a pencil where the terms favored Ravenscroft too generously. "You have moved the profit split 2 points in your favor on the timber clause," she said without looking up. Nicholas turned a page in his own folio. "And you will move it back. That is why I put it there. It gives you something to win in front of Hargrove, which makes you look strong at the negotiating table." Genevieve glanced up. He was watching the road ahead through the front window, his expression flat and unreadable. She could not tell if he was being strategic or honest, and she suspected both. "You might have simply offered fair terms to begin with," she said. "Fair terms do not build reputations. Victories do." She studied him for a moment longer, then returned to the documents. He was infuriating. He was also, she was beginning to realize, extremely good at this. They had been climbing for nearly an hour when the carriage slowed. Genevieve looked up from the folio as the wheels ground to a stop. Through the front window, she could see the road ahead curving around a steep embankment before straightening into the final stretch of the mountain pass. And blocking that stretch, turned sideways across the narrow track, was a heavy black carriage she recognized instantly. Her stomach dropped. "Edmund," she breathed. Her brother's carriage sat square across the road, like a barricade. Edmund himself stood beside it, with his arms folded, his riding coat unbuttoned despite the morning chill. Behind him, her younger brother Charles leaned against the carriage wheel, with the deceptive calm of a man who had been talked into something reckless and was now fully committed to seeing it through. Nicholas's coachman pulled the horses to a halt. The two carriages faced each other across 30 feet of muddy road, with nothing but cold air and old hostility between them. "Your brothers," Nicholas said, his voice carefully neutral. "My brothers." Edmund started walking toward them. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with their father's square jaw and their mother's talent for holding a grudge. Charles followed 2 paces behind, his hand resting on his belt where Genevieve knew he kept a folding knife he had carried since boyhood. They looked like men who had ridden through the night to be here. "If they reach this carriage," Genevieve said quickly, "there will be a scene. Edmund will demand I leave with him. You will refuse, or he will insult you, and either way, every servant and traveler on this road will carry the story to town by lunchtime. The truce dies before the first contract is signed." Nicholas was already moving. He leaned forward and rapped twice on the partition behind the coachman's seat. "Bridle path, left side, 50 yards back." The coachman hesitated for only a breath before hauling the reins. The horses protested, tossing their heads as the carriage lurched backward and then swung hard to the left, off the main track and onto a narrow bridle path that descended sharply through a stand of old birch trees. Branches scraped along the roof and sides like fingernails on wood. Genevieve gripped the seat as the carriage tilted at an angle that made her stomach lurch. Through the rear window, she saw Edmund break into a run, his mouth open in a shout she could not hear over the rattling of the wheels. Charles sprinted toward their own carriage, but the road was too narrow to turn quickly, and by the time he reached the driver's box, Nicholas's coachman had already pushed the horses into a fast trot down the hillside. The bridle path was barely wide enough for the carriage. Wet branches slapped against the windows, the wheels skidded on loose stones, and twice the whole vehicle shuddered as it struck embedded roots that jutted from the earth like old bones. Nicholas braced one hand against the ceiling and the other against the door frame, his jaw set, his eyes fixed ahead. "This path reconnects with the valley road 3 miles south," he said. "We can circle around and approach Oakhaven from the western side." "That adds 2 hours to the journey." "It does." "We will miss Hargrove." "We will be late for Hargrove. That is different." He looked at her. "A man who has waited will listen more carefully than a man who has been kept to schedule." The carriage burst out of the tree line and onto a wider farm track, the wheels finding firmer ground. The valley opened up below them, green patchwork fields stitched together by stone walls, a river glinting grey in the distance, and beyond it, the faint outline of the mountain ridge where Oakhaven sat tucked between 2 peaks. Genevieve exhaled and loosened her grip on the seat. Her knuckles ached, her pulse was still hammering, and somewhere behind them, on a blocked mountain pass, her brothers were standing in the mud, furious and outwitted. She would deal with Edmund later. Right now, the contracts could not wait. "The western approach," she said. "How well do you know the road?" Nicholas settled back against the seat and picked up his folio, as though the last 10 minutes had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. "Well enough." The western approach to Oakhaven was longer than Nicholas had promised. The farm track wound through the valley floor for miles before climbing again into the foothills, and by late morning the sky had darkened from pale grey to something closer to iron. The wind picked up first, bending the tall grass flat against the fields and sending loose leaves spiraling across the road. Then the rain returned, heavier this time, falling in sheets that hammered the carriage roof and turned the track beneath them into a river of brown water.
The coachman pulled up twice to check the wheels. The second time, he climbed down and knocked on the carriage door, water streaming from the brim of his hat. "Your Grace, the road ahead is washed through, 1/2 mile of standing water across the low crossing, and the river has come up over the bridge stones. I cannot take the horses through it safely." Nicholas opened the door and leaned out into the rain. Genevieve watched him scan the landscape, the flooded crossing ahead, the hillside to the east, the dark mass of woodland to the west. His hair was soaked within seconds, and he pulled back inside with water running down his collar. "There is a hunting lodge a 1/4 mile up the eastern ridge," he said. "Timber Ridge Lodge. It belongs to Sir William Holt. He uses it during the autumn shoot and keeps it shuttered the rest of the year. We passed the turning a few minutes ago." "You want to wait out the storm in someone else's empty lodge?" "I want to keep the horses alive and the carriage intact. Sir William is a practical man. He would rather we used his lodge than drowned on his road." The coachman turned the carriage around, and they found the track leading up to Timber Ridge within minutes. The lodge itself appeared through the trees like something half forgotten, a solid stone building with a slate roof, shuttered windows, and a covered porch where firewood was stacked beneath oilcloth. It was modest by the standards of the gentry, built for function rather than elegance, with a stable block attached to the eastern wall. The coachman unhitched the horses and led them into the stable, while Nicholas forced the front door with a shoulder and a firm hand on the latch. The lock was old and yielded without much argument. Inside, the air smelled of cold hearth ash, dried lavender, and the faint mustiness of rooms that had been closed too long. A main sitting room occupied most of the ground floor, furnished with heavy oak chairs, a long dining table, and a stone fireplace large enough to stand in. A narrow staircase led to sleeping quarters above. Shelves along one wall held books, candle stubs, and a collection of old maps rolled into leather tubes. Genevieve stood in the doorway and surveyed the room. This was not how the day was supposed to unfold. By now, she should have been sitting across from Hargrove in a warm office in Oakhaven, signing documents that would secure her estate's income for years. Instead, she was stranded in a hunting lodge with the one man in the county she had sworn never to trust. Nicholas knelt by the fireplace and began building a fire with the efficiency of someone who had done it many times before. Kindling first, then split logs from the stack by the hearth, then a match struck against the stone. The flame caught and spread, and within minutes the room was filling with warmth and the smell of burning oak. "There is a larder through the back," he said, standing and brushing ash from his hands. "Sir William keeps it stocked between seasons. Tinned goods, dried meat, tea. You seem very familiar with this place. I have shot here twice as Sir William's guest. He is one of the few men in the district who does business with both our families without choosing sides." He paused. "I suspect that is why his lodge sits exactly between our two territories." Genevieve almost smiled at that. Almost. They ate a simple meal at the long table, cold ham, hard cheese, bread that was stale but passable, and strong black tea brewed in a kettle over the fire. The rain battered the shutters and showed no sign of easing. The coachman had settled in the stable with the horses, and the lodge creaked and groaned around them like an old ship riding out a swell. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The fire popped and hissed. Genevieve held her teacup between both hands and stared into the flames, her mind working through the logistics of the missed meeting. She would need to send word to Hargrove. She would need to write to Edmund before he did something reckless. She would need to explain this entire situation to her household steward, who already disapproved of the arrangement and would disapprove even more when he learned she had spent the night in a remote lodge with the Duke of Ravenscroft. "Your brothers rode through the night to intercept us," Nicholas said. He was sitting across from her, his coat drying on the back of a chair, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow. "Someone told them about our arrangement very quickly. Edmund has informants among my household staff. He always has. He is protective. He is stubborn. There is a difference." Nicholas turned his teacup slowly on the table.
My younger sister is the same. She wrote me a letter last month warning me that my business strategies were going to bankrupt the estate within 5 years. She included charts. Genevieve looked up. Was she right? She was close enough to make me uncomfortable. The laugh escaped before Genevieve could catch it, a short, surprised sound that seemed to startle both of them. Nicholas watched her with an expression she had not seen from him before, something quieter than his usual composure, something almost warm.
This feud, Genevieve said after a moment, setting down her cup. How much has it actually cost you? Honestly.
He met her eyes across the table. The firelight moved across his face, and for a few seconds, the Duke of Ravenscroft looked like nothing more than a tired man carrying a weight he had never asked for. Everything it has cost you, he said. Every contract, every alliance, every evening spent alone in a house full of empty rooms, wondering whether any of it was worth inheriting. The rain hammered the roof above them, and the fire crackled in the silence, and Genevieve realized she had spent 3 years hating a man who understood her life better than anyone she had ever met. The storm held through the night and into the following morning. Genevieve slept in the upstairs bedroom with the door bolted, wrapped in blankets that smelled of cedar and camphor. Nicholas took the settle beside the fireplace downstairs, feeding logs into the flames at intervals to keep the chill from reclaiming the room. By dawn, the rain had softened to a steady drizzle, but the coachman reported that the river crossing was still impassable. Another day at least, he estimated, before the water dropped enough to risk the horses. Genevieve accepted this with the grim practicality of a woman who had learned long ago that plans were suggestions the world enjoyed refusing. She brewed tea, ate the last of the bread with a scraping of preserved jam from the larder, and began searching the lodge for writing materials. If she could not reach Oakhaven, she could at least draft revised contract terms and prepare correspondence for the moment they were free to move again. The lodge's main room served double duty as Sir William Holt's private study when he was in residence. A writing desk sat beneath the front window, its drawers stocked with ink, blotting paper, and quills that needed trimming. The bookshelves held hunting journals, almanacs, and a surprising number of legal texts. Sir William had trained as a solicitor before inheriting his land, and his reading habits had followed him into the countryside. Nicholas had settled at the far end of the room with a different purpose. The shelves near the fireplace held a collection of rolled documents, old maps, property surveys, and bound ledgers that recorded land transactions across the district going back nearly a century. He had pulled several of these down and spread them across the dining table, studying boundary lines and ownership records with the focused attention of a man looking for something specific. "What are you searching for?" Genevieve asked from the writing desk.
"The original survey lines between our two estates. My solicitor has always claimed the eastern boundary was redrawn in my grandfather's time, but I have never seen the original document. Sir William keeps copies of every land registry filing in the district. If the original exists, it may be here." Genevieve set down her quill. The eastern boundary was a sore point. 1,200 acres of prime grazing land that both families claimed, and neither could prove clear title to. It had been the subject of 3 separate legal actions in her lifetime alone, each one ending in stalemate. She crossed the room and stood beside him at the table. The documents were old, their edges browned and soft with age. Nicholas had arranged them in chronological order, surveys from the early part of the century on the left, progressing through decades of amendments, transfers, and filings toward the right. His finger rested on a gap in the sequence. "There should be a survey here, dated 1803, the year my grandfather purchased the eastern parcel from the Whitfield estate. Every record I have references it, but the document itself has never been in our family's archive." "Ours either," Genevieve said. "My father searched for it before he died. He believed your grandfather had destroyed it to hide an irregularity in the purchase." "And my grandfather believed yours had stolen it for the same reason." They looked at each other across the spread of yellowed papers, and the absurdity of it. 2 families spending decades accusing each other of hiding a document that neither possessed, settled over them like dust.
Genevieve reached for the bound ledger nearest the gap. It was a collection of correspondence rather than official filings. Letters exchanged between landowners, solicitors, and the district's appointed auditors during the early years of the century. She opened it carefully, the leather binding cracking along the spine, and began turning pages. The letters were dense and formal, written in the cramped, precise hand that solicitors of that era favored. Most concerned routine matters: grazing rights, water access, mill fees. But halfway through the volume, Genevieve found a sequence of letters that made her stop. "Nicholas," he leaned over her shoulder. The letters were addressed to both their grandfathers and bore the signature of a man named Percival Crane, the district auditor who had overseen land valuations during the period in question. Genevieve read the first letter aloud, her voice slowing as the meaning of the words became clear. Crane had written to her grandfather claiming that the Ravenscroft estate had filed a formal challenge to the Ashford family's water rights along the eastern boundary. The letter included what appeared to be a copy of the challenge document, complete with the old Duke of Ravenscroft's signature. The next letter in the sequence was addressed to Nicholas's grandfather. In it, Crane claimed the Ashford estate had filed an identical challenge against Ravenscroft's grazing rights, again with an attached copy bearing a signature. "These challenges," Nicholas said quietly. "My family's archive contains the one supposedly sent by your grandfather. We have treated it as proof of Ashford aggression for 3 generations. And we have the one supposedly sent by yours." Genevieve turned to the next page. "Look at this." The final document in the sequence was a private memorandum, never sent, written in Crane's own hand. It was a set of personal accounts, payments received from a third party for what Crane described as valuation adjustments and boundary modifications. The figures were enormous. And at the bottom of the page, in smaller script, Crane had recorded the transfer of 1,200 acres, the disputed eastern parcel, into a holding company registered under his own family's name. Genevieve sat down heavily in the nearest chair. The feud, the bitter, generational war that had consumed both their families, destroyed alliances, drained fortunes, and left Genevieve eating stale bread in a hunting lodge with a man she had been raised to despise, had been manufactured, invented from whole cloth by a corrupt auditor who had forged documents, fabricated disputes, and stolen the very land both families had spent decades fighting over. "Crane," Nicholas said. The single word carried more weight than anything she had heard him say. "The Crane family still operates in the district. His grandson holds a seat on the Merchant Guild." Genevieve looked up at him. The fire had burned low behind them, and in the grey morning light, his face held something she recognized because she felt it mirroring in her own chest. A fury so deep and so steady it did not need to raise its voice. "Then we ride to the guild hall," she said, "and we end this." The river crossing cleared by late afternoon, and they were on the road within the hour. Nicholas had the coachman bypass Oakhaven entirely and drive straight for the capital, a market city called Hartfield that sat 2 counties east, where the Regional Merchant Guild kept its formal headquarters. The journey took the rest of the day and most of the evening. They stopped once to change horses at a coaching inn on the turnpike, and Genevieve used the time to write 3 letters. One to her steward, explaining her absence. One to Hargrove, requesting the contract meeting be postponed by a week. And one to Edmund, which contained exactly 2 sentences. "I am safe. Do nothing until I return." She sealed all 3 with her ring and paid the innkeeper's boy to send them by the morning post. They reached Hartfield after dark and took separate rooms at a respectable inn near the cathedral close. Genevieve slept poorly. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Percival Crane's handwriting, that careful, deliberate script recording payments and stolen acreage as calmly as a shopkeeper tallying the day's receipts. 3 generations of misery, catalogued in neat columns. The Merchant Guild Hall occupied a stone building on the city's high street, wedged between a bank and a solicitor's chambers. It was an old structure, built in the previous century, with tall, arched windows and the guild's coat of arms carved above the entrance, a pair of scales flanked by sheaves of wheat, the kind of building designed to look trustworthy and permanent, which Genevieve now found deeply irritating. They arrived at 9 o'clock, which was when the guild's offices opened for business.
Nicholas carried the leather folio containing the original letters and Crane's private memorandum, wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from the lingering damp. Genevieve carried a second folio with her own estate's copies of the forged challenge documents, the ones her family had believed were genuine for 60 years. The clerk at the front desk was a young man with ink-stained fingers and a nervous disposition. He looked up as they entered and immediately recognized Nicholas, which was evident from the way his posture straightened and his face lost most of its color.
"Your Grace, how may I—" "We are here to see Guildmaster Crane," Nicholas said. "The matter is urgent." "Mr. Crane is in his offices, Your Grace, but he has appointments this morning, and I am not certain—" "He will see us," Genevieve said.
She placed both hands flat on the clerk's desk and leaned forward just enough to hold his attention. "You may tell him that Lady Ashford and the Duke of Ravenscroft are here together. I suspect he will make time." The clerk disappeared up the staircase. He was gone for less than 2 minutes, which told Genevieve everything she needed to know about how quickly the name Ashford and Ravenscroft together traveled through a building. Arthur Crane's office occupied the first floor of the Guildhall, overlooking the high street through 2 tall windows. It was furnished in the manner of a man who wanted visitors to understand his success: mahogany desk, leather chairs, framed certificates on the walls, a globe on a brass stand that served no practical purpose. Crane himself rose from behind the desk as they entered. He was a man of perhaps 50, well-fed and well-dressed, with the kind of broad, pleasant face that was built for putting people at ease during difficult negotiations.
"Lady Ashford, Your Grace." He gestured toward the chairs arranged before his desk.
"What an unexpected pleasure. I confess, I did not expect to see the two of you arriving together."
"No," Nicholas said. "I imagine you did not." He did not sit, neither did Genevieve. Nicholas opened the leather folio on Crane's desk and laid out the documents one by one: the forged challenge letters, Crane's grandfather's private memorandum, the accounts showing payments received for fabricating the dispute. He arranged them in sequence without commentary, letting the papers speak in the silence of the room. Crane watched the documents appear on his desk the way a man watches a crack spreading across a frozen pond beneath his feet. His expression held its pleasant shape for the first 2 pages. By the third, the color had begun to leave his cheeks.
By the time Nicholas placed the final document, the memorandum detailing the transfer of 1,200 acres into the Crane family's private holding company, the guild master's composure had crumbled entirely.
"Where did you find these?"
His voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper.
"In a neutral archive," Genevieve said, "stored alongside official district records that your grandfather oversaw as auditor. The documents carry his signature, his handwriting, and his personal seal. They describe, in considerable detail, a scheme to forge boundary challenges in both our families' names, provoke a feud between our estates, and acquire the disputed land while we were too busy blaming each other to examine the actual records."
Crane sat down slowly. His hands were flat on the desk, fingers spread, as if the surface were the only thing keeping him upright.
"You currently hold the title to 1,200 acres of eastern grazing land," Nicholas said. "Land your family acquired through fraud. You also hold a seat on this guild's governing board, a seat that was secured, in part, through the wealth generated by that stolen property."
"I had no knowledge of my grandfather's—"
"Your grandfather's actions are a matter for historians," Genevieve cut in. "What concerns us is the present. You hold stolen land. You hold a position built on the profits of that land, and you hold it while 2 families have spent 60 years destroying each other over a quarrel your family invented." The room was very quiet. Through the window, Genevieve could hear the high street waking up. Cartwheels on cobblestones, a vendor calling out prices, the ordinary sounds of a city that had no idea what was happening in this office. Nicholas opened a second folio and placed a single sheet of paper in front of Crane. Genevieve recognized it. They had drafted it together at the inn the previous evening, working by candlelight at a small table while the city settled into sleep around them. This document transfers the 1,200 acres back to joint custody of the Ashford and Ravenscroft estates, Nicholas said. It also contains a formal written apology acknowledging your family's role in the fabrication of the dispute. You will sign both. Crane looked at the paper. He looked at Nicholas. He looked at Genevieve. And whatever he saw in their faces, the shared resolve, the absolute certainty, the unified front of two people who had discovered they were far more dangerous together than they had ever been apart, told him that negotiation was finished. He picked up his pen and signed. The ride back from Hartfield took the better part of 2 days. They traveled at a slower pace than the urgent dash that had brought them to the capital. The horses were tired, the roads still soft from the storm, and something in the air between them had changed in a way that made haste feel unnecessary. The business was done, the documents were signed, the land was coming home. And for the first time in days, there was nothing to chase, nothing to outrun, and no crisis demanding their next move. Genevieve spent most of the journey with the curtain pulled back, watching the countryside scroll past in long green panels, hedgerows thick with hawthorn, stone churches sitting in the folds of valleys, flocks of sheep moving across distant hillsides like slow clouds dragging their shadows. She had seen this landscape 1,000 times from carriage windows, but it looked different now, lighter somehow, as though a film had been cleaned from the glass. Nicholas was quieter than usual. He read for a while, slept for a stretch with his head tilted against the seat back, and spent long periods simply looking out at the passing fields with an expression Genevieve could not quite read. Twice she caught him watching her instead of the road, and both times he looked away without comment. They parted at the crossroads south of Oakhaven. Genevieve's estate lay to the west, the Ravenscroft lands to the east. Nicholas told her his solicitor would prepare the formal paperwork for the land transfer within the week, and invited her to the Ravenscroft estate the following day to begin dividing the recovered property. "Bring your own surveyor if you like," he said through the carriage window as her driver prepared to depart. "I want this done properly." "I will bring my surveyor, my steward, and my solicitor," Genevieve replied. "You may outnumber me in charm, Your Grace, but you will not outnumber me at a property negotiation." The corner of his mouth lifted. "I would not dream of it, Lady Ashford." She arrived home to a household in quiet uproar. Mrs. Aldridge met her at the door with a face that communicated 6 days of accumulated worry compressed into a single expression. Her steward had received the letter and kept the estate running in her absence, though his written summary of the week's events included 3 underlined sentences about the impropriety of her traveling arrangements. Edmund had received his letter as well and had responded with a message so brief it was practically a threat. "We will discuss this in person." Genevieve dealt with all of it in the space of an evening, reassuring Mrs. Aldridge, reviewing the steward's accounts, and writing Edmund a longer letter that explained the situation with enough detail to prevent him from riding south with a grievance and a hunting rifle. Then she slept for 10 hours straight and woke feeling more rested than she had in months. The Ravenscroft estate sat on a broad swell of land east of the river, surrounded by parkland that had been shaped by 3 generations of careful planting. The main house was Georgian, pale stone, symmetrical wings, tall windows that caught the morning sun and held it in long rectangles across the gravel drive. It was larger than Ashford Hall and better maintained, which Genevieve noted with the professional eye of a woman who knew exactly what good maintenance cost. Nicholas met her in the entrance hall and led her through to the garden terrace, where a table had been set with the survey maps, the signed transfer documents from Crane, and a pot of tea. His solicitor was present, a quiet, precise man named Fletcher, who spoke only when the law required clarification. Genevieve's own solicitor arrived shortly after, along with her surveyor, a weathered Scotsman named Brodie,
who had been mapping boundaries in the district for 30 years. The division of the 1,200 acres took most of the morning. It was careful, detailed work, matching old boundary stones to current maps, calculating grazing value per acre, accounting for water access and timber rights. Genevieve and Nicholas negotiated each parcel with the focused attention of two people who understood land the way musicians understand pitch. They disagreed on 3 points, compromised on 2, and deferred the third to a joint assessment by their surveyors. By early afternoon, the solicitors had drafted the final agreement and both parties had signed. Brody rolled up his maps, Fletcher collected his papers, and the professional business of the day was complete. The others departed, and Genevieve found herself standing alone with Nicholas in the Ravenscroft Gardens. The grounds were beautiful in a way she had never permitted herself to notice. Gravel paths wound between borders of lavender and rose, leading toward a walled garden at the far end, where espaliered fruit trees spread their branches flat against warm brick. A stone bench sat beneath an old copper beech, its seat worn smooth by decades of use. The afternoon sun fell through the leaves in shifting coins of gold. "Walk with me," Nicholas said. It was not quite a question. They followed the gravel path in silence for a while. The air smelled of cut grass and warm stone, and somewhere beyond the garden wall, a blackbird was singing in repeated liquid phrases. "I owe you an honest admission," Nicholas said. He stopped walking and turned to face her. "When I came to your door 5 days ago, I had a strategy, a clean, logical plan to stabilize both our estates through a public display of cooperation. Every step was calculated, the ball, the contracts, the merchants. I knew exactly what I was doing and exactly what I expected to gain from it." "I know," Genevieve said. "So did I." "Then you should also know that the strategy stopped working on the second day." She looked at him carefully. The afternoon light was warm on his face, and he was watching her with an expression she had seen glimpses of over the past 5 days. At the hunting lodge, across the dining table, through the carriage window at the crossroads. She had catalogued each instance and filed them away as things she would examine later, when it was safe, when the business was finished and her judgment was clear. "It stopped working," he continued, "because I stopped thinking about contracts. I stopped calculating advantages. Somewhere between the storm and the lodge and that ride to Hartfield, I started thinking about what it would be like to come home to a house where you were waiting. And I have not been able to stop." The blackbird sang. The leaves turned gold above them, and Genevieve, who had spent 3 years learning to stand alone in empty rooms, felt something shift in her chest that no ledger and no contract could quantify. "Nicholas," she said quietly. It was the first time she had used his Christian name. He heard it. She saw it register, the way his breath caught and his eyes softened, and his whole composure, that careful armor he wore so well, loosened by a single degree. "I am not a woman who makes decisions quickly," she said. "But I am also not a woman who ignores the evidence when it is standing directly in front of her." She stepped forward and placed her hand on his chest, just above the heart. "Come to Ashford Hall tomorrow. Come to the front door. And this time, I will be the one with a proposition." The morning arrived with the kind of stillness that follows a long season of noise. Genevieve was awake before the sun cleared the tree line. She dressed simply, a cream-colored day dress with a high collar and pearl buttons, her mother's earrings, her hair pinned loosely at the nape of her neck. No ball gown, no armor. She chose the clothes the way she had chosen her words the previous afternoon in the Ravenscroft Gardens, with care, with intention, and with the understanding that what was about to happen would not benefit from decoration. She took breakfast alone in the morning room, though she ate very little. Mrs. Aldridge brought tea and toast and set them down without comment, but she lingered near the sideboard longer than necessary, straightening things that were already straight. Mrs. Aldridge. "My lady?" "When the Duke arrives, show him to the garden. "The walled garden, where my mother kept the roses." The housekeeper paused. In 15 years, Genevieve had never received a guest in that garden. It was the one private corner of the estate she had kept entirely for herself, the place where her mother had spent her final summer, tending the climbers along the south wall while her health faded and the light in the house grew dimmer by the week. Genevieve maintained it personally, trimming the beds each spring, replacing the stones along the path when they cracked, keeping the wooden bench oiled and clean. It was the only space at Ashford Hall that did not appear in any estate ledger or household inventory. It existed outside the business of the family because it had always belonged to something softer than business. Mrs. Aldridge understood all of this, without a word of it being spoken. She nodded once and left the room. Genevieve carried her tea to the study and stood at the window where she had stood 6 days earlier, watching the empty drive and wondering whether she would spend another season alone. The view was the same: the gravel sweep, the iron gates, the avenue of lime trees that her grandfather had planted the year he built the house. The sky above was washed clean by the days of rain, pale blue and cloudless, with the particular brightness that comes when the weather has exhausted itself and has nothing left to give except clarity. She heard the hooves before she saw the carriage. Nicholas came through the gates at a walk. He was not in his own grand carriage this time, but on horseback, a tall bay mare with a gleaming coat and a calm, steady gait. He wore a dark blue riding coat, polished boots, and no hat. His hair lifted slightly in the breeze as he rode up the drive, and he sat in the saddle with the easy balance of a man who had grown up on land and understood the rhythm of a horse the way he understood the rhythm of negotiation, through feel, through patience, through knowing when to hold firm and when to give. He dismounted at the front steps and handed the reins to the groom who appeared from the stable yard. Then he reached into the saddlebag and withdrew a small wooden box, which he held in one hand as he climbed the steps to the front door. The door was open. Genevieve had ordered it left open since dawn. Mrs. Aldridge met him in the entrance hall and guided him through the house without ceremony, past the study, past the morning room, through the corridor that led to the east wing, and out through the garden door into the walled enclosure where the roses grew. Genevieve was waiting on the bench beneath the south wall. The climbers above her were in full bloom, pale pink and deep crimson, their petals heavy with the last traces of morning dew. The air in the walled garden was warm and fragrant, sheltered from the breeze by the old brick, and the light fell in a single, unbroken column from the open sky above. Nicholas walked the stone path toward her, and she watched him come with a feeling she had spent the entire previous evening trying to name. It was not the sharp, electric awareness of the ballroom, or the cautious respect of the carriage, or the raw honesty of the hunting lodge. It was something quieter, something that had been building so gradually she had mistaken it for familiarity, the way a person mistakes the slow warming of a room for stillness because the cold leaves so gently they never feel it go. He stopped in front of the bench and looked at her for a long moment. Then he sat down beside her, close enough that his sleeve brushed hers, and placed the wooden box on his knee. "You said you had a proposition," he said. "I did. But you came with a box, so I suspect yours is more formal than mine." He opened the lid. Inside, resting on a fold of dark velvet, was a ring. It was old, Georgian by the look of it, a single oval sapphire set in gold with 2 small diamonds flanking the stone. The band was thin and delicate, made for a woman's hand, and the gold had the soft, warm patina of something that had been worn and loved and passed down with purpose. "It was my grandmother's," Nicholas said. "She wore it for 43 years. My mother kept it for me and asked that I give it only when I was certain." "And are you?" "I have been certain since the lodge. I have been certain since you laughed at your own teacup, and I realized I wanted to hear that sound every morning for the rest of my life." He lifted the ring from the box.
This is not a contract, Genevieve. This is not strategy. I am not here for land or trade or the opinions of merchants. I am here because 5 days ago, I knocked on the door of a woman I thought was my rival, and I discovered she was the only person in the world who understands what it costs to carry a name like ours. He held the ring between his fingers, waiting. Genevieve looked at the sapphire, then at the roses climbing the wall above them, then at the man sitting beside her who had, in the space of less than a week, dismantled every wall she had built around herself with the quiet, persistent patience of water wearing through stone. "My proposition," she said, "was going to be far less eloquent." "Tell me anyway." She took the ring from his fingers and slid it onto her own hand. It fit perfectly, the gold warm against her skin, the sapphire catching the morning light in a flash of deep blue. "Stay," she said. "That was the whole of it. Just stay." Nicholas took her hand, the one wearing his grandmother's ring, and held it between both of his, "For as long as you will have me." Somewhere beyond the garden wall, the blackbird from the Ravenscroft estate had found a new perch in the lime trees along the Ashford Drive, and it was singing again, the same bright, repeating phrases, carrying easily across the open ground between the two estates, as though the distance had never mattered at all.